Polarity, the balance of power, and war. We're going to take a look at the balance of power theory and its underlying components, including alliances and some of the controversies within it that explains war and peace. First, we need to examine the assumptions of realism, and then we turn to alliances, which are the building blocks of balance of power mechanics. Here you can see the early strategy on the left, diplomatic, in which Bismarck was able to isolate France. And then the gradual erosion of that policy as Germany became more assertive, and its encirclement diplomatically in the lead up to the First World War. This is an essential illustration of the mechanics of the balance of power. Countries changing alliances and reordering the groupings of states. Now, balance of power is important because it contradicts and challenges the assumptions of deterrence by arguing that the likelihood of war is not captured by the dyad. It's not one country versus another in comparing their strengths. Rather, war occurs in a system of multiple states, and that countries go to war when the opportunity becomes available in a balance of power system. For example, when Japan attacked China in 1895, it did so after it was able to be assured that Russia, Germany, and France were either distracted or deterred by Japan's alliance with England. So third parties that could intervene in a conflict between two countries in a dyad, they need special attention. They need to be distracted or deterred by other parties. When Japan attacked Russia in 1905, again, Japan relied on England to deal with the possible threatened intervention of Germany and France. These are the assumptions of realism. First, anarchy. And this implies not chaos or disorder. It implies simply there's no overarching authority which pervades the system. So actors pursue self-help strategies. 2. The principal actors are powerful states, which are termed powers, not smaller powers or institutions. Smaller powers exist, institutions exist, but the balance of power is largely dependent on what these larger states do. Number 3, anarchy causes states to fear elimination. So states seek power in order to maximize their security, where security is the equivalent of the probability of further survival. And they seek to do this at minimal cost. 4, states are approximately rational in the sense that through a process of natural selection, those states that seek not to survive or are led poorly are selected out. Number 5, states focus on the power of other states rather than their intentions, because intentions can change very quickly with a change of leadership or a change of domestic situation. 6, states are defensive positionalists, meaning their relative position in the international system is the focus of their elite leadership. So countries are more focused on relative gains rather than absolute gains. They don't want to lose relative power, but gaining additional power without comparison to another state is less important. Now, an aspect of this is the loss of strength gradient. Countries have power, and they can reach out and extend that power, but the farther they reach out, the lower power they have. And this is important because countries don't have an equal reach from where they are geographically. Now, most of the evidence is that countries will challenge each other where the loss of strength gradients are generally equal. So a powerful state can reach a lot farther out than a smaller state, but that they're more likely to fight each other where their relative power, geographically speaking, is more or less even. Now, alliance theory is very important because it provides the building blocks of the balance of power mechanic. So the essential focus question is, are alliances a cause of war or peace? Now, states, to strengthen themselves against external threats, can pursue one of two strategies, according to Kenneth Waltz. The first is internal balancing. A country can build internal resources, such as weapons, but this is very often very expensive. For example, the arms race engaged in by the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War was both an attempt to use their internal resources to strengthen their ability to intervene and protect their allies. The declining effect of power over distance is, as I mentioned earlier, measured by the loss of strength gradient. So here's a very simple graphic representation of it. You can see how a wealthy state has a much longer reach than a poor state. So military force allows states to, if they have to go to war, they can go to war farther out from their territory and not inside their territory. And here you can see the intersection between the red loss of strength gradient and a green loss of strength gradient between states A and B. Now state B's got an aircraft carrier, so that they can pass the geographic midline and extend their power even farther to the crossover point. And so we would expect conflict to occur at that crossover point. Another type of balancing is external balancing. Here, states make external alliances with other states against the main threat. But this entails a different kind of cost. For example, the formation by the United States of NATO during the Cold War was an instrument that was used to try to block the threat of an attack by the Soviet Union. You can also see in this picture a depiction of the blue, which are the Western Allies, the red, which is the Soviet Union and its communist allies, against the Axis forces of Japan, Italy, and Germany during the Second World War. So you have two large alliances here, but ultimately broke into another two alliances between, rather confrontations between red and blue at the end of the Second World War. Now, according to Stephen Walt, states exhibit two generally different types of alliance behavior. The first is balance against power. This means you oppose a country that threatens you, and it's based on the enemy's power. And you basically join other countries that also recognize that threat as a common threat, and so an alliance is formed. Balance of power is powerful because it's so parsimonious. It seems to work. We think of the case of communist China and the USSR. The US foreign policy was always to limit the confrontation against communist China in the hope that eventually it would turn against the Soviet Union. The argument against that was, here you had two states with the same communist ideology. They're supposed to be cooperating, fraternally, working together. But in the end, US foreign policy was more correct. The US assumed that balance of power mechanics would eventually cause these two powerful neighboring countries to turn on each other, and that policy turned out to be a great success, and it was based on sound theory. Walt also has a second type of proposal for balance, which is balance against threat. And here Walt argues that states prioritize balancing against power, but they will also balance against ideological threats once their basic security is taken care of. And number three, this explains why coalitions tend to be overwhelming and not rationally a minimum winning coalition. Now, we saw that countries want to minimize the amount of resources they spend on security. So countries are going to therefore rationally look for a minimum winning coalition, because in a smaller coalition, they have to compromise less, they have a greater proportion of control over policy, and if the coalition wins anything, they get a larger share of the pie. But with an overwhelming coalition, of course, they're much more powerful. And in many cases, there are overwhelming coalitions because countries gather together on the basis of ideology. During the Second World War, Nazi Germany was heavily outnumbered because a great many states that wanted simple things like free commerce got involved in the war against Germany. For example, Brazil deployed 2 divisions of soldiers to fight alongside the Allies in the Italian campaign during the Second World War. So Brazil balanced against the threat. And so you had this very large, overwhelming coalition, which wasn't rational from the sense of looking for the minimum winning coalition, meaning the smallest possible coalition you need to win. In fact, we had an overwhelming coalition. So Stephen Walt's a balance of threat has four variables. One is the aggregate power, which is basically balancing against a threat. Geographic proximity, the closer you are to the threat, the more likely you are to oppose it. Whether the threat has offensive power, meaning the ability to expand, perhaps through offensive maneuver capabilities. And the fourth variable is its aggressive intentions. And Walt argues that aggressive intentions are very important and neglected by balance of power. So it's basically balance of power, which is incredibly simple and parsimonious, versus balance of threat, which is more complicated. Where balance of power would predict a minimum winning coalition, the balance of threat is able to explain why we have occasionally overwhelming coalitions. Another behavior is bandwagoning. Bandwagoning is a metaphor of elections in the American West 2 centuries ago, when farmers would come into town during an election period and wouldn't have time to assess the candidate, so they would simply look at the wagon going back and forth and see how many people were on which wagon, and they would vote for the wagon with the most people in it, assuming that that was a good representation of which politician deserved to get the vote, because the farmer wasn't really connected to the politics of what was going on in the urban area. In international relations, it means to join with the threat. In other words, you submit to the major threatening country so that you do not appear to be a threat to them, and that you therefore hope that you do not become the target of their attack. This strategy is typically pursued when the state is too weak to resist and there is no prospect of finding allies. Now, the classic example is Finland at the end of the Second World War. Finland bandwagoned with the Soviet Union. It simply was too weak to fight the Soviet Union off. And there were no allies in the region. Sweden did not want to ally with Finland against the Soviet Union. So Finland submitted. It basically agreed to buy Soviet equipment. It didn't join NATO. And it adopted a security policy that was in no way a threat to the USSR. Now we can consider countries and ask whether they're balancing or bandwagoning. Is Canada balancing it against an external threat in conjunction with the US? Or is Canada bandwagoning with the US because of the US's overwhelming strength? Or is it a combination of both? There's also the phenomenon of the management alliance. This is when a country allies to contain a potential threat. The classic example is the US and Japanese alliance during the Cold War and since the end of the Cold War. Japan and the US were each militarily more powerful than China, so they couldn't be balancing in the 1950s. So the idea was that the US allied with Japan to restrain Japan, make it secure, and this made other countries in the region that were American allies more secure. So that Taiwan, the Philippines, South Korea, Australia were more secure because the US was able to engage Japan in an alliance. And so Japan didn't have to build up a big military, and so all the US allies and the US and Japan were better off. One of the hypotheses that Walt confirms is that ideology only has a temporary effect on alignment. Even states with similar ideologies will eventually succumb to balancing behavior. So management alliance is a way of trying to extend that common liberal ideology in the case of the US and Japan. But as I mentioned earlier, countries with the same ideology can turn on each other, like communist USSR and China. Another example are the Ba'ath political parties that were present in both Iraq and Syria, led to a legitimacy crisis that led to a border conflict in the late 1970s between the two states. There's an additional type of bandwagoning behavior which is elaborated on by Randall Schweller. Some states are offensive bandwagoners in the sense that they side with the stronger side in a war in order to have the opportunity to reap some benefits or spoils from that war. Similar to the way jackals will benefit by waiting for a lion to kill an animal, and then they will join the lion and partake in some of the food. So this is termed jackal bandwagoning. It tends to occur at the end of wars when the outcome is far more certain. Very often, Italy's participation with Germany in World War II against France was seen as jackal bandwagoning. Italy didn't join the war at the outset. It basically waited until Germany was winning decisively against France in 1940, and then Italy intervened in an attack against the French in the Mediterranean. We can also see how Brazil joined at the end of World War II with the US. Although Brazil did not participate in World War II in order to achieve territorial gain, it did it so that it could have influence on the international system after the end of the war. However, alliances have various mechanics that participant states must keep in mind, some of which may lead to dysfunctions. Much of the work here is done by Glenn Snyder. The first dilemma is burden sharing. Every alliance must have some agreement on the distribution of the burden. Since not all agreements are fair, how do you try to balance out the inequities of an agreement? During the Second World War, the Soviet Union bore a greater share in defeating Nazi Germany than did England. Right? And so the Soviet Union would occasionally threaten to try to make a separate peace, although that was very unlikely. So the British and Americans tried their best to show that they were committed to participating in the war so that the Soviet Union didn't have to bear the burden of confronting most of the Nazi German military in the Soviet Union. If you don't specify the distribution of the burden, you could get a dysfunction called free riding, also called buck passing. Free riding or buck passing in an alliance occurs when one alliance partner calculates it can contribute less to an alliance because other states have less of a choice. The country I'm thinking about here, of course, is Canada, which has consistently provided relatively little to NATO's defense starting in the late 1960s, knowing that the United States and Germany simply couldn't reduce their contributions. However, when free riding occurs among major states in an alliance, there's the threat of departure and the collapse of the alliance. Now, because Germany would not commit to Italian interests in the First World War, Italy defected from its alliance with Germany and in fact joined the English and French side. So in World War I, Italy fought with England and France. And in World War II, it fought with Germany. Now, the statistical evidence is that most alliances are reliable and actually abandonment is fairly rare. Another consideration in alliances is the commitment problem. To keep states from distancing or defecting from their alliance and joining the enemy, which is termed abandonment, allies must demonstrate commitment, or what's also called binding. This can be done by stationing troops in your ally's territory. If the enemy attacks, you will automatically be at war with the enemy. During most of the Cold War and into the 1990s, but not currently, the US stationed the 2nd Division in the Uijeongbu Corridor, which is the main corridor from North Korea to the South Korean capital of Seoul. So if North Korea ever attacked South Korea, the first force they would encounter on the main route of advance would be the US. So the US was committed to the war. Another consideration is chain ganging. This comes from the concept of prisoners chained together, so if one prisoner falls, all the other prisoners are brought down also. So this is an inverse problem. If a state is too closely committed to an ally, the ally might drag that state into a war against its choosing. This is termed entrapment. Germany in the First World War was desperate to have an ally. Its main prospect for a reliable ally was Austria-Hungary. But Austria-Hungary was undergoing domestic collapse. In particular, the various different identity groups within the empire wanted to secede. So when Austria-Hungary ended up in a dispute with Serbia, Germany had no choice. It had to cooperate and support Austria-Hungary, because if it didn't, Austria-Hungary would either collapse or it would drift away and look for another ally. So Germany, desperate for allies, allowed itself, in one interpretation, to be dragged into the First World War over a dispute between its ally and Serbia. So a minor issue in the Balkans became a major cause of the First World War. There's also defensive chain ganging. Here, you can restrain a country from going to war that otherwise would have by engaging in a defensive alliance with it. So what are some of the implications? Well, the main implication is on the collective action problem. This is a theory by economist Mansur Olson. Organizing group of states to cooperate together becomes exponentially more complex because of a number of problems. The first one is the calculation problem. Coordination costs increase with the number of states in an alliance. Imagine if there's a war between two countries and you have to bet which country would win. Imagine then a third country becomes involved. It becomes more difficult to make the calculation. You don't know which country the third country is going to join, or if a fourth country, or if a fifth country. The mathematics of it is that you have an exponential increase in the complexity of calculating an outcome as you get more actors in a problem. That's the calculation problem. We live in a world of 200 and more countries. Imagine how complex it is for diplomats to coordinate a country's security relations. The second issue is the free rider problem. This is the problem of cheating. Countries are going to join an alliance and not pay, but they're going to get the benefits. This is also captured by the tragedy of the commons, where you have a group of countries cooperating over the distribution of a common good, but then they abuse that good. Number three, the sanctioning problem. If one of the countries cheats, to punish that country takes resources. It's not rational for a given country to go and then punish that free rider, because punishment itself requires coordinating action by the members of the alliance. So it's another collective action problem. So ultimately, the collective action problem predicts that most alliances will be minimum winning coalitions. States will seek to minimize costs and the coordination costs of the calculation problem, the free rider problem, the sanctioning problem, and will therefore seek the smallest possible alliance to achieve their security goals. So let's take a look at the First World War and the argument that it was the association of alliances that led the war to break out and then to escalate. And there's some argument for this, but it should be recognized that the First World War had many causes, and this is one of those causes. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, there's the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand by a Serbian nationalist student. Austria-Hungary issues an ultimatum to Serbia that would effectively ended Serbian sovereignty. 1 month later, on July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia because of irredentist support by Serbs in Vojvodina in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Russia mobilizes against Austria-Hungary and Germany. They had to do this because Russia was an ally of Serbia, and if they didn't mobilize, they would have been seen to be abandoning allies. Germany decided, therefore, to attack France because France was an ally of Russia. So for Germany to defeat Russia, they would first have to defeat France. So Germany attacked France. But to attack France in a safe way, they wouldn't attack directly through the Lorraine, they would attack through Belgium. And so they swung their army through Belgium in a preemptive strike. So Germany attacked France before France could attack Germany. Now England had a very unclear deterrence policy with regard to Belgium. Belgium contained Europe's largest port at Antwerp, and the English had traditionally wanted to neutralize Antwerp. So the British didn't warn Germany not to go through Belgium, but once the Germans went through Belgium, the British balanced against Germany and declared war. On August 23, 1914, Japan jackal bandwagoned. Because Germany had islands in the Pacific, Japan declared war on Germany and seized the German islands, principally the Marianas and the Caroline Islands. Japan then deployed a flotilla to the eastern Mediterranean to help the Allies chase German submarines. On October 1914, the Ottoman joined Germany. The Ottoman Empire, which was under pressure from the English and the French, calculated that Germany would win. So it was a case of bad bandwagoning calculation. May 23rd, 1915, Italy, after being neutral, was offered Tyrol, which is a part of the Austrian-Italian Alps that Italy had claimed. So Italy joined the Allies against Austria and Germany in a form of good calculating bandwagoning. In the end, Italy joined the winning side and they were able to take possession of the Tyrol. Late in 1915, Bulgaria joined the war, primarily to counterbalance the Greeks who had the support of the English and the French. So it was logical balancing behavior. In the summer of 1916, Romania made a calculation that was very difficult. Germany was doing quite well against Russia. Romania had very little hope of getting an ally to the region. But Romania wanted to get Transylvania from Hungary. So Romania declared war against the Austrians, the Hungarians, and the Germans, and it was very quickly defeated. But at the end of the war, because it had joined the Allies granted it control of Transylvania. So this was a good, a well-calculated jackal bandwagon. In April of 1917, the United States, because of threat to its commerce, and because of the Zimmermann telegram, where the Germans encouraged the Mexicans to invade the U.S. declared war on Germany. And so this is a function of balancing, moving against the biggest threat in the system to you. Now, the general criticism is that alliances matter less than rivalry patterns for determining how wars spread. So if you recall enduring rivalries, some argue that the balance of power system shows shifting alliances and predicts the size of alliances, but wars happen because two states are focused on each other obsessively and they're ignoring the system. So what's the statistical evidence? Well, the correlates of war lists 414 alliances, of which 78.3% were bilateral. So most alliances are just between two countries. 49.5% are mutual defense pacts like NATO, where they're facing a common threat and they're coordinating their defense. 35% are non-aggression agreements. Basically, countries make treaties to not threaten each other. Both the Russia today and China today have an agreement to keep their military forces at least 100 miles from their common border. And 15.5% are consultation agreements like the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. Most alliances are created in anticipation of war. So if you were to do a regression, you'd see that before a war, alliances emerged. And so you could come up with the false conclusion that alliances cause war. But they don't. Countries see wars about to happen, and then they get the alliance. Now, with the exception of the First World War, overall, in the last 500 years, alliances do not normally precede war and do not cause war. If we were to break down the relationships, major power alliances were associated with war from the 16th to the 18th century. But in the 19th century, they were associated with peace. In the 16th to 18th century, the general leadership of countries in Europe were predatorial. You had monarchs or you had Dutch and English business people, and they were out to build empires following the logic of mercantilism. But in the 19th century, there was a common recognition that society was changing, and that war led to revolution, which led to Bonapartism, or basically despotic conquest. And so the 19th century goal was to use alliances to try to keep countries from going to war. Jack Levy argues that this relationship is spurious since alliances anticipate rather than cause war. Alliances are also associated with peace during the Cold War more than in prior centuries. However, of course, we don't know if it's the alliances that kept the peace or if it's nuclear weapons. However, very high or low clustering of states into alliances leads to more severe and lengthy conflicts. If every country in the world joins one or the other alliances, it means that they're anticipating a war. As well, alliances do increase the size of wars through chain ganging. And this is from the correlates of war evidence from 1816 to 1965. War is contagious within regions in time and across contiguous borders, but not between continents, according to the correlates of war from 1816 to 1980. So we could see war spread in a region, but most of the time wars don't spread across continents. Of course, they do sometimes. Now, there are exceptions. Dyads, that's a pair of countries with one rather than two of the states with external alliances, are more likely to result in war. So we have the case of 1815 to 1965. And this is because proxies are more restrained. Alliances are a function of states seeking general deterrence. So their effects have already been calculated by the initiators. If you join an alliance, it's because you want to look so strong, no one's even going to compete with you. That's the best possible outcome, because then you don't have to spend a lot of money on your military. A dyadic dispute in which one side does not have an ally increases the likelihood of war by 300%. So having allies does help bring peace through strength. An offensive alliance, which is an alliance where two countries join together in order to attack a target, an example of which would be the Syrian-Egyptian offensive alliance against Israel in their 1973 October War, increases the likelihood of a dispute of escalation to war by 8 to 14%. In effect, alliances reduce the likelihood of war, but they increase the diffusion of war once it's begun. So let's look now at the balance of power. The balance of power theory has a long tradition and is one of the earliest theories of state behavior. Kautilya, who is an advisor of Chandragupta, and who probably wrote the treatise on the theory of the conduct of international relations, the Arthasastra, the Manual of Politics, has an excellent treatment on the logic of alliances. In fact, in that text you have the famous dictum, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," which originated in the Arthasastra. So you have alliances. The tacit alliance between the United States and Communist China against the Soviet Union in 1971 is an example of two countries that are not friendly. The US was anti-communist. China was anti-capitalist and certainly anti-Western. But the US and China got together nonetheless against the Soviet Union because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, in the traditional balance of power theory, we have an argument that in all systems there's a general tendency for the weaker states to get together and ally together against the greatest emerging threat to the system. Therefore, the system is always in equilibrium, and domination of the system by a single state is impossible. As a threat to the system is defeated and declines, and a new threat emerges, states will then readjust their balancing and forge new alliances. We can see this, of course, with the end of the Cold War and the decline of Russia and the rise of China. We can see countries changing their alignments as a consequence. A balance of power system provides stability in three ways. One, the system retains all of its essential characteristics of governance, like the laws of commerce and international institutions, so that no single nation becomes dominant. Number two, that most of the members continue to survive. Number three, that large-scale war does not occur. Now, this rejects an assumption that we're going to see in a later lecture. So here we have a balance of power system. We have a number of different circles that represent countries of different power and size. The actual way they combine, aside from the principle that countries balance against power, the precise way they join into alliances is actually indeterminate mathematically. And people have been looking for formula to try to make a prediction for a very long time. So once you have countries joined together, there's some principles, which is they're going to search for a minimum winning coalition to simplify calculations because they want to limit the amount of resources they spend, and they want to maximize their influence in the organization, and they have the collective action problem. But besides that, it's very indeterminate who's going to join what side. Now, one of the later theories we're going to see is called hegemonic stability theory. Balance of power rejects hegemonic stability's assumption that you always have a hegemon. The hegemon is a Greek term for the single greatest power in the system. Today that would be characterized by, say, the United States. It's got an overwhelming economy, it has a huge cultural influence, it dominates global commerce and global security, and it's at the head of the most powerful alliances. Balance of power theory says the US is nothing special. It's not a hegemon. It's not even a superpower, it's simply a great power. So we'll look later at hegemonic stability theory. You can make a comparison. Now, balance of power does seem to have a lot of validity. Repeated attempts to unify Europe have repeatedly failed because they provoked overwhelming blocking coalitions. So here we have a list of attempts to unify Europe, the Austro-Spanish Habsburgs, and that lasted for a century with huge conflicts in Italy and in the cockpit of Europe, which is Belgium and Holland. Louis XIV's wars. He tried to expand all the way to Jerusalem, but was blocked by a coalition of Austrians, English, and Dutch. The Napoleonic Wars, which unified Europe for a while, but never overcame the resistance of England. The Wilhelmine Germans, that ultimately ended up in the First World War. And the attempt by Nazi Germany to create a new order in Europe. The balance of power also applies to India. India was never unified. Specifically, in its largest pre-modern empires, it never contained the Chola Peninsula in the south. Chola is not weak. Chola is the center of global commerce that goes through the Indian Ocean from China to the Middle East to Europe. Jeans come from Chola. In fact, the reason denim became so popular in Europe was European sailors got to Chola and they saw all these wealthy Indians wearing cotton pants. And then they took them to France where they got indigo and other dyes, and then they changed them into blue jeans. Chola was powerful enough to invade and destroy the Indonesian empire of Majapahit with a giant navy. So India has a balance of power dynamic where, however powerful the states in the north, they could never conquer the states in the south. Here we have other periods of states in South Asia, and they never quite achieved domination of the entire subcontinent. Now, 18th century Europe typified balancing. This is the 1700s. 18th century Europe was a balance of power example that is used as the ultimate case of countries shifting their alliances because of new emerging threats. Now, in this period, there were 8 major global powers at the time, including Manchu China, the Ottoman Empire, and Mughal India. But all of these were in relative decline, and they were isolated from each other because of the European domination of the oceans. There was, of course, the Nadir Shah's Iran. They had tried to build a navy, but their navy was destroyed by the Europeans. And then you had the main European states, England, France, Russia, Spain, and Austria. So this is the distribution of power in the world. The oceans controlled by the Europeans. So in Europe, there were, of course, England, France, Russia, Spain, and Austria, all of which, except Austria, had a military reach outside of Europe. Each of the wars in Europe, therefore, were accompanied by wars on other continents, typically in North America, on the African coast, in India, and later on in the Far East. So let's take a look at some of these wars. The first war was the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. The war was fought over control of the Spanish throne. France and Spain opposed England, Austria, and Holland, and were accompanied by Queen Anne's War in North America. So here you can see the countries on the different side. There followed the War of the Quadruple Alliance, 1718 to 1720. The war was fought over the succession in France. Here we have England, France, and Holland opposing Spain. Here you can see the 2 general alliances. There followed then the War of the Polish Succession, 1733 to 1738. The war was over the succession in Poland. It was France, Spain, and Sardinia against Austria and Russia. Here again are the 2 sides. There followed then the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748. The war was over the succession in Austria, and you had France, Spain, and Prussia versus Austria and England. This was accompanied by the First Carnatic War in India between England and France, and King George's War in North America between the English and the French settlers. There then followed the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763. Austria, France, Russia, Sweden, and Saxony opposed Prussia and England. It was accompanied by the French and Indian War in North America and by the Anglo-French War in India. And here you can see the two different sides. So what's the key observation that could be made of the 18th century period? It's a period that's typified as the balance of power period because states changed sides frequently as it suited them. The same phenomenon occurred in other parts of Europe. If you were to do a study of the Baltic between Sweden and Russia and Denmark and the other countries there, Poland, you would see the same dynamic of constant changing alliances. So, for example, England fought both with and against France and Austria. Now, this is not a sign of inconsistency. It's a sign of good statecraft. England's policy was to oppose any state from becoming preponderant in continental Europe, with the idea that this would lead to an eventual invasion of England. And England's been obsessed about avoiding invasion from mainland Europe. In fact, the only time England was threatened by invasion was by the Spanish Armada in 1588, Louis XIV, and Napoleon and Adolf Hitler. And the rest of the times you had smaller invasions by the Spanish or French in Ireland, and you had threats of invasion. But most of the time, England was quite successful at neutralizing the invasion attempt by engaging in balance of power politics on the continent. So what are some of the criticisms of balance of power theory? Well, first of all, there's a problem of trade-offs between the goals of a balance of power system. So you could have a war to stop the domination of the system. I mean, this is the whole logic of World War II. There was a tremendous war fought to stop the Nazis from expanding. So clearly the balance of power system failed in the lead up to the Second World War. Number two, you could have domination of a system to stop the war. I mean, one of the U.S. grand strategy goals is to democratize the world, essentially influence the world using its own liberal form of domestic politics before nuclear weapons spread. Because if nuclear weapons spread while there are still authoritarian militarized governments, we could have a giant nuclear war in the future. So it makes sense sometimes to dominate the system to avoid war. Number three, you could have a war to prevent the conquest of smaller powers. The U.S. intervened to protect Kuwait against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. England declared war to protect Poland. Number four, you could engage in conquest to preserve the characteristics of the system. This is the Brezhnev doctrine. The Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968 as a warning to other communist countries not to liberalize in order to preserve the balance of the system. Now, some argue that the balance of power only works under special conditions. It's not a universal observation. One, you have to have moderate competitive behavior among the states, typically caused by religious or cultural restraint. The 18th century was no accident. In the century before, the 17th century, you had a violent war called the 30 Years' War, which involved most of the countries of Central Europe. Germany's population was reduced from 24 million to 16 million. They lost a third of their people in the violence. The 30 Years' War was a religious war between Catholics and Protestants. But by the end of the war, it had basically delegitimized religion. The war concluded with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1848, and the Pope was not invited to the peace negotiations. Europeans shifted their allegiance from the religion, which was a part of their identity, and shifted instead their allegiance to the state. And so we have the modern system born. So the 18th century, a century later, there was moderation. People no longer wanted to fight to the death over religious principles. Number two, you have to have a norm against the annihilation of states. Spain was eventually ground down during the Habsburg period. Louis XIV's France was fought to the point of exhaustion. Germany was defeated in World War I and World War II. The Russians at the end of the Cold War were, well, dismantled from the perspective of their influence in the Warsaw Pact. But all of these states were reincorporated into the international system. None of them were destroyed. If you start destroying states in the international system, you're going to shrink how many states there are in the system, undermining the balance of power dynamic, and you're going to create empires. Number 3, there should be no impediments to the free balancing of states, such as pacifism or democracy. Pacifism, which was a reaction to the violence of World War I and the high costs paid by European societies in obeying what were mostly either authoritarian or mercantile leaderships, led to the rise of Hitler and led to the failure of deterrence. People didn't want another war, and so they didn't stand up and stop Hitler early on. Also, democracy. Democracies are famous for not engaging in preventative war. There's one exception, which is the U.S. attack on Iraq in 2003, in which the U.S. moved to prevent Iraq from eventually developing nuclear weapons. Not really a credible argument, but it was cheaper for the U.S. to invade Iraq and dismantle it than for the U.S. to keep it under siege forever. So if you have a democracy and a rising power, like the rise of China, the U.S. is not going to act until China invades Taiwan. Now, breaking into letter values, A, critics argue that the balance of power system is dysfunctional because it often requires an invulnerable neutral state like England to repeatedly join the weaker side. So England is an offshore balancer. It floats off on the coast of Europe and it intervenes and picks whichever side is weakest and backs them. If you look at Asia, Japan never played the role of balancer. It played the role of intervener. It would invade through Korea into China. And so it was constantly hostile to everyone on the continent. On the other hand, when China was invaded by Japan in the 1930s, almost 1/3 of all Chinese soldiers in China were fighting with the Japanese against other Chinese. So Japan has played the role of offshore balancer, but it wasn't always to keep the states in Asia independent. The second observation, which is B, is that the balance of power does not always succeed. Sometimes multi-state regions do unify. China is the classic example. During the Warring States period, the state of Qin, which is depicted as deep red in the map on the right, and as sort of a darker color on the extreme west border in the map on the left, Qin started to consume the states one by one until it brought all of Zhongguo together. And Europeans went to visit, and they visited at the time that Zhongguo was unified, and so Europeans call China, China, from Qin. So we have a research puzzle here, which is why did China unify where Europe and India did not? Was it for particular geographic or technological reasons? Tinbor Hui wrote an article on that as a part of her book, and I think it's in your reader. It did fail in Europe. The Romans were able to unify Europe around the Mediterranean, and there was no substantial urbanized power that resisted them. You had the Dacians for a short while. You had, of course, the Parthians that were quite distant, but there was no other urbanized challenger to the Romans. Of course, periodically, China's broken up again. So maybe the balance of power does work in some way in China, but it only works sometimes when whatever factors allow China to unify allow it to break apart. Now, C, consideration. It's possible that the balance of power applies only to land warfare. So it applies to continents like Europe. It applies to East Asia. And so it cannot explain the tendency for global naval hegemony. Naval hegemony depends on the oceans. It depends on the observation that it's very easy to move across the oceans. So if you have a fleet and someone else has a fleet, it's easy for the two fleets to meet and for the stronger to defeat the weaker. On land, movement is much more difficult. So if you have a lot of power, you have enormous costs just to cover a short distance. So if you look at the world today, the U.S. Navy is so powerful it could probably declare war on every other floating object and win. The U.S. has 10 fleet carriers. The U.S. has 10 amphibious carriers. That's 20 aircraft carriers. Its competitors are China with 3, Russia with 1, Thailand, which recently got rid of theirs, Spain with 1, Italy with 1, France with 1, England with 2, Brazil with 1. So the US has more aircraft carriers than the rest of the world put together. So it's possible that hegemony theory, which we're going to look at later on, applies to the naval dimension of global power, and balance of power applies to the terrestrial dimension of power. And D, balance of power is a theory to explain the absence of terrestrial hegemony, but it doesn't explain peace. In fact, for balance of power to work, you have to have a lot of war. When people say that balance of power brings peace, they're making a promise that's not genuine. Balance of power needs to enforce itself against threats. And those threats don't always understand that an alliance is there to deter them. Now, a major cause of overexpansion is the misperception of the balance of power. Specifically, there's a belief that the international system operates not according to the balancing principle, but according to the bandwagoning principle. In a bandwagoning world, strength attracts allies. It causes states to submit through bandwagoning. And this then spreads like dominoes and leads to spheres of influence. Louis XIV bullied his neighbors in the Rhineland. Napoleon did the same. Hitler did the same to Eastern Europe. To some extent, all of these leaders believed that the world was operating according to the bandwagoning principle and that aggression and threats would be rewarded. We think today of the way that China is behaving towards its neighbors: Vietnam, Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Mongolia, India, and Myanmar. So, I mean, there's issues there with China's belief in a bandwagoning environment. China's clearly trying to create an exclusive sphere of influence. Now, these states therefore behave very aggressively, thinking that they could intimidate states to bandwagon with them and not balance against them. Instead, their aggressive behavior provoked an overwhelming coalition of all the other states in the region. If you think about it today, China, how many allies does it have? It has an ally of convenience in Pakistan, but Pakistan is not an atheist communist state. It's a democracy. Many Pakistani elites understand the West better than they do China. North Korea is a very opportunistic state, but it balances between China and Russia. It's obviously seeking independence from China. Myanmar is clearly a bandwagoner. Perhaps there's Zimbabwe, minor countries that also challenge the system like China does. In the 1930s, it seemed Hitler was right at first. His intimidation slowed down the process of coordinated balancing, so that France and England and Poland and Russia and Czechoslovakia were unprepared to fight Germany. Russia should have had an alliance with France, but they were concerned over ideological reasons. France should have protected Czechoslovakia, but for a moment of additional years of peace, they basically abandoned Czechoslovakia. So these countries created their coalition slower than Hitler could intimidate them into separating from the coalition. Now, there are many causes of this misperception, and we're going to take a look at some of these. Now, there are some controversies in the balance of power. There is, first of all, the bipolarity versus multipolarity controversy. So I have a question. Does a system of a few major powers or many medium powers create greater peace? Now, we can now focus on a dispute between, say, classical realists and Neorealists over the effects of polarity on war and peace. A world of two great powers or a world of many medium powers, which is safer from major war and domination? Now, the essence of the argument centers on the impact of uncertainty and the effect this has on decisions to go to war by leaders. On balance, does uncertainty create opportunism, or does it create caution? So let's take a look at the role of uncertainty. Now, classical realists, these are the realists starting with Morgenthau in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. For them, uncertainty leads to peace because action is deterred by the threat of third-party intervention. So you're not going to go to war if you're not sure what other countries are going to do. Certainty leads to war because certainty simplifies the aggressor's calculation for war. So these are states that are not immediately involved in a dyadic dispute. You know, they can pick either side. Now, Geoffrey Blaney is an Australian historian, and he put a lot of focus on third-party behavior being crucial in the balance of power. So you have two countries that are confronting each other in a dyad, and then you have all these other countries. We call those countries third parties because they could join either side. They could extend help. They could join an alliance with one of the countries. Now, there's an elaboration of his argument by Okubo Toshimichi, who wrote about Japan's 1873 attack on Korea. For Japan to attack Korea in that year, it needed to exploit external rivalries. So it basically adopted a policy where it waited for foreign countries that could intervene to end up in a dispute with each other. So China was distracted, Russia was distracted, the French and the Germans were distracted, and the English were distracted. Now, this comes from a poem called The Waterbird Dilemma, in which you have a fisherman and he's fishing, and when he pulls up the net with the fish, all the birds basically eat the fish. So what the fisherman did was he took a fish and he threw it on the other side of the boat. And all the water birds chased that one fish, fighting between each other, and then the fisherman was able to bring in the net with all the fish in the net. So this is the diplomatic strategy that countries need to adopt. They need to distract third-party interveners. So the basic explanation for the classical realists is as the number of actors increases, which is an overwhelming calculation problem, the number of interaction opportunities as an intervening variable increases, and this then leads to stability. Because everyone's afraid of what this complex possibility of intervention by third parties is going to do to their war. You also have cross-cutting pressures and alliances. In other words, you have countries that ally with each other and they're not necessarily jointly allied. Like Thailand today has very close relations, both with China and the US, even though the US and China confront each other. Pakistan has very good relations with both the US and China, even though China and the US occasionally confront each other. So these cross-cutting pressures in the alliances create a better self-balancing system. Plus, the number of countries leads to a reduced allocation of attention. There are 200 countries in the world. So you can't distribute 1/2 of 1% of your attention in the foreign ministry to each of these countries. Some matter more than others, and a lot of countries are simply ignored. In fact, the US intelligence service in the Navy that spies on Latin American navies is the Reserve, not the Defense Intelligence Agency. So they get reservists on weekends to look at satellite photos of the Peruvian Navy, because the Pentagon does not have the money to focus on that goal. So Wagner is a game theoretic author in political science, and he asked the basic question, will states act to eliminate others if there's a war? Wagner believed that the uncertainty of the future, basically by threatening conflict, could create stability. For example, if you had a tripolar situation, you had 3 different countries, it looks like you have inevitable elimination. But because the country that's the weakest can threaten to join the defending side against the attacker, both of the bigger countries are going to keep the peace and preserve that smaller buffer state. So classical realists argue that certainty creates war. Opportunists will attack, whereas uncertainty creates peace by causing aggressors, like Adolf Hitler, for example, to think twice before they attacked. Therefore, multipolarity creates peace. Now, we can think of a place that was multipolar and bipolar, and we could compare the two instances. Yugoslavia, at the end of World War I, was made up of some of the remnant states of Austria-Hungary and the independent state of Serbia, and it unified into Yugoslavia, a country of southern Balkan Slavs. It then broke up in the 1990s. And we can ask the question, is that region more prone or less prone since it broke up? Now, the Neorealists argue the opposite. For Neorealists, certainty leads to peace because there are fewer wars that are caused by miscalculation. Uncertainty leads to war because aggressors are permitted an opportunity to act. And most of those calculations are miscalculations. Hitler lost. Napoleon lost. Louis XIV lost. Kenneth Waltz developed neorealism out of microeconomic theory in his 1975 book, Theory of International Politics. Bipolarity, for Kenneth Waltz, is the most stable. It leads to predictable outcomes. In a bipolarity, you can easily count the states. During the Cold War, there were two states, the USSR and the US. So the balance of power doesn't work. Mearsheimer argues that multipolarity causes more war because the balancing is more certain. So there is more buck passing and in effect less balancing. What does that mean? Well, in the lead up to World War II, the Soviet Union and France were thinking about an alliance. And if they had thought of an alliance and implemented it, they could have stopped Nazi Germany. But Russia believed, the Soviet Union believed, that France and England as capitalist states were trying to trick Hitler to attacking the Soviet Union. The French and English believed that the Soviet Union wanted England and France to basically bear the full cost of the war. So they never made an alliance. Instead, the Soviet Union signed a peace agreement with Nazi Germany, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and with that cover and that buck passing by the Soviet Union to France, Nazi Germany attacked and conquered France and then turned around and invaded the Soviet Union. Now, during the Cold War, we have something called the Long Peace. And here you can see the bipolar situation between the Soviet Union, the US, and all their nuclear weapons, and the no man's land between them, which consists of Canada and Greenland. Now, during the Long Peace, which was the period of peace during the Cold War, from 1947-48, which is the Berlin Crisis, the beginning of the Cold War, to the end of the Cold War, 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we had no major conflict between the two major powers. Now, some argue that it was because of nuclear weapons. But Kenneth Waltz argues that it was the bipolarity of the system that created the simplicity. Even if an ally left, let's say France left NATO, or China abandoned the Soviet Union, or Egypt left the Soviet Union, it didn't have a major effect because most of the power was contained by these two major countries. So imagine a world of 1920s or 1930s Europe with a wide distribution of nuclear weapons. Kenneth Waltz would argue that you could have a nuclear war under those circumstances. It's the bipolarity of the system for Kenneth Waltz, a lot more than the presence of nuclear weapons, that led to the peace, the long peace, in which the Cold War never turned violent. So what's the statistical evidence? Well, the evidence is that bipolar periods have a greater number of small wars. Basically, you've got these two major powers and they fight on the margins. And multipolar periods are less war-prone, but have very large wars when they do break out. And this is from a data set, not from the Correlates of War, but from another data set from 1494 to 1983. So it covers approximately 500 years. The next controversy is the parity versus preponderance controversy. So within a bipolar world, or a world dominated by two coalitions of many smaller states, which is more likely to lead to peace? Is it parity, where you've got approximate equality between two sides or two states, or preponderance, where one side is much stronger than the other? Which is a better design for peace? Now, some argue that the parity of a balance of power or bipolar system brings war because each state is tempted by the fact that they have an even chance of victory in a war, and that only preponderance brings peace. Of course, the problem with this logic is you can have two countries that are equally strong and they get into a war, and the war basically lasts forever. In fact, not all wars are won or lost. A great many wars end up in endless stalemates. Others argue that preponderance encourages war because the larger state is undeterred and therefore attacks the smaller state. Peace is therefore achieved by having a parity so that no one state can dominate the other. So what's the statistical evidence? Well, although there are studies that provide findings in both directions, the prevailing evidence is that preponderance is associated with peace and that parity is associated with war, and the balance of power is therefore more war-prone. According to Reed, 2000, dyadic parity is more likely to experience a dispute, but less prone to escalate, presumably because there is less of a prospect of victory. Power parity decreases the probability of escalation by 5%. And finally, there's the unipolarity argument. So since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. has been the largest economic and military power in the world. U.S. strategy with regard to the Eurasian continent remains the same as England with regard to Europe, to oppose the consolidation of the continent under any single power, whether it's Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, or China. The main problem with being the most powerful state in the world is that according to the logic of balance of power, it's supposed to provoke a counter-coalition. But has it? The problem is that there doesn't appear to be a counter-coalition. Europe is not balancing against the U.S. Russia's not making the same effort as the Soviet Union. China trades with the U.S. at the same time as it threatens some U.S. allies in the Pacific Rim. The most likely reason is that it's too early in the process to tell. Or that the peaceful nature of democratic regimes has somehow changed the nature of how balance of power works in the international system. Now, what's the statistical evidence? It is that unipolar systems are the most peaceful. Between 1494 to 1983, when you have a single country with the most power, like Spain at its peak, or Napoleonic France, or Louis XIV's France at its peak, you're the most likely to have peace. So this is a graph representing most war-prone to least war-prone. The green represents preponderance, and bipolarity, the intersection, and it's the most peaceful. The red, which is multipolar parity, is the most war-prone. And the two gray zones are sort of an intermediate category. Bipolar parity and preponderant multipolarity are less war-prone than multipolarity, but more war-prone than preponderance. So classical realism. Well, classical realism argues that interests are defined in terms of power. So the balance of power has some basic alliance formation assumptions, which is that states will join the weaker coalition, and states prefer to join with a weaker ally because then they get more influence. Now, this has been articulated by Carl Deutsch and J. David Singer. And they argue that multipolarity is the most stable, meaning less war-prone, because one, third parties counterbalance emerging threats, and two, coalitions rebalance to deter newly emerging threats. So this is the baseline theory, mostly from military and diplomatic historians and political scientists in the 1950s and 60s. Geoffrey Blaney wrote a book in 1971, very well known, called The Causes of War. And these are some of his observations. States acquire weapons to defend, to coerce, and to attack. Coercing meaning you're threatening, but you're not necessarily attacking. States can use weapons to coerce by threatening war. Even when states risk war, war is never accidental. War happens when the leaders of two states choose war. If either or both states choose to submit, there would be peace. So war happens when states disagree on their relative power. Geoffrey Blaney makes additional observations. Bilateral wars escalate to general wars because, and if you think about it, World War I, Austria-Hungary against Serbia, or Germany against Poland in World War II, all of these dyadic conflicts erupted into much larger scale general conflicts. Number one, when there is no deterring fear of domestic revolution. So countries go to war when their domestic situations are stable. Two, states join solid alliances to stop future decisive defeats. An example would be France and the UK, confronting Germany in 1910. Three, major powers intervene to stop a decisive enemy victory. Russia and France intervened in 1895 to limit the territorial gains Japan made against China, particularly on the Shandong Peninsula. As well, general wars or world wars, and if you recall, there are an estimated 10 of these, and they account for 90% of all the deaths in interstate conflicts. General wars are long because, one, there are no third parties remaining to reduce the restraint to go to war. or rather to increase the restraint to go to war. Once every country has picked a side, there's nothing left to do but go to war. For example, in World War II, Japan was originally deterred by going to war by the USSR. But when Nazi Germany invaded the USSR in 1941, Japan then felt free to attack Pearl Harbor a few months later. Number 2, victory causes states to expand their war aims. Countries start a war, and when they become victorious, they go for more conquests. They don't stop. They don't become conservative. Number 3, coalitions are typically evenly balanced. And so they get into a very long war of attrition. The biggest battle in Western history and the biggest battle in the First World War was the Battle of Verdun, where millions of French and German soldiers slaughtered each other. And it didn't stop. It just went on and on and on, because both coalitions had approximately the same resources before the Americans entered the war. Number 4, there are multiple fronts, so victory is difficult. In the First World War, you had a war in East Africa. You had war in the Near East, you had war in the Balkans, you had war in the Caucasus, you had war in all the different parts of Europe, and you had submarine conflicts in many of the oceans. Number 5, alliance coalitions make achieving peace difficult because the countries disagree. And so they come to some very broad common agreement to continue the war rather than make peace. Now, Robert Gilpin wrote a very profound book called War and Change in World Politics in 1981, which is a very broad survey of centuries of why countries went to war. Paul Kennedy wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers in 1987, which looked at the previous 5 centuries of what caused the great powers to rise and what caused them to then decline. Now, change is a constant in the international system. And it's caused by differential economic and demographic growth rates in states. Some states grow quickly, others grow slowly. And this explains mostly the rise and fall of states, rise and fall of the great powers. States will expand and go to war as long as there are incentives to do so, so long as the benefits exceed the costs. Nation states prevailed because only they could create the bureaucracies and concentrate the financial capital to buy military power. So here are some of the hypotheses. Systems with preponderant powers are the most peaceful. Now, Bueno de Mesquita helped develop expected utility theory, which is symbolized by EUT, particularly in his book entitled The War Trap in 1981. Expected utility is a form of games theory. A state will initiate war if it is relatively stronger than its adversary, plus the total effect of clustered allies and third parties in the international system, as controlled for by geographic distance, the risk propensity of decision maker, and the level of uncertainty. Now, there are some limitations to this theory. It thus specifies a necessary condition, right? So you have to have this condition satisfied for a country to go to war, but it's not a sufficient condition. And therefore, it doesn't tell us when the country will go to war. It just tells us what conditions must be satisfied for the country to go to war. So we don't have an if-then statement. The most accurate measure of power, which it makes it impressive, but it doesn't predict war causation. It's mathematically complex and elegant, and it has very strong verification through statistics, but it's got some major validity issues. So expected utility theory, a form of games theory, was tested on a correlates of war set of Dyads, in which Bueno de Mesquita collected 250,000 country pairs to test his theory. These are the formulas for expected utility theory. It's actually much simpler than you think. This is a graph showing how Bueno de Mesquita estimated alliance aggregation. So you would create a chart like this and then get a number from the chart, and that number would be used to evaluate the strength of the alliance or the particular allegiance the country had. Now, there are some counterintuitive findings from Bueno de Mesquita's expected utility theory. He did a complex analysis of third-party behavior. 1. Weaker states can initiate conflicts against stronger states if they have allies. 2. Alliance constellations are complex and can be disrupted by war. 3. Former close allies can attack each other because of third-party indifference. 4. If attacking coalitions, states will attack enemies with limited reach last. 5. Weak states may seek victory by dragging out wars, by reducing the intensity of the war. 6. Weak states may seek victory by amplifying war intensity. 7. Weak states that will lose more than an attacker gains from war will negotiate. And 8. Nuclear weapons matter less than conventionally equipped allies for determining war outcomes. Now, defensive realism is a variant of neorealism, and it comes out of Kenneth Waltz's 1979 theory of international politics. Bipolar structures reduce the likelihood of war. We saw this already. The simplicity of bipolar systems reduces the likelihood of miscalculation. If you think about it, World War I was a series of miscalculations, starting with a complicated alliance system that escalated. Both poles dominate their allies, which reduces the likelihood of chain ganging. The Americans control their allies. If the allies misbehave, the US restrains them. Both the USSR and the US have cut off aid to Israel, to Pakistan, in order to contain their behavior. The case of the USSR and the US during the Cold War shows the absence of major war can be explained by bipolarity rather than nuclear deterrence. Now, Joseph Greco is another defensive realist, and he argued that there is something called the endowment effect. States are risk acceptant with regard to recapturing losses and risk averse with regard to capturing gains. So when a people lose their land, they're going to fight disproportionately aggressively in order to get it back. Because their logic is, we've lost this. We're in the domain of losses. We need to fight hard to get it back. But when a country has a perspective that it's no longer their territory, or they captured the territory, so, it's a nice bonus, but it's not something they're going to die over, then they're going to be risk averse. So, for example, Canada tried with some adventurers to capture Wrangel Island from Russia during the Soviet Civil War. So look at the map and look for Wrangel Island in the Arctic. And when the Russians showed up and kicked the Canadians off in 1923, 1921, the Canadians there and the Americans there just left. Alaska is not something that Russia really wants to fight to get back, because they sold it. Palestine, on the other hand, for Palestinians, is a goal that continues to reverberate. So different people remember losses or gains differently, and this can drive conflicts. Now, Jack Snyder and Christensen did an analysis of alliance strength, and they argued that in a perceived offensive advantage environment, an environment where it pays to attack, an environment where, for example, tanks work well in the desert, there tends to be a very high level of fear. This leads to chain-ganged alliances. People join alliances, and they desperately need the alliances because they don't want to be attacked by a strong coalition, but then they're dragged into situations they don't want to be. And so this is exemplified by World War I. Austria-Hungary chain-ganged Germany because in the lead-up to World War I, every country was building a powerful mobilization system based on the railways, so you had an offensive structure to the system. In a perceived defensive advantage environment, such as a world where it's very difficult to expand, like, say, Vietnam against Thailand, you have difficult terrain and jungle, it's very difficult to conquer large bits of terrain. Here, the incentive is to buck pass and free ride. So in the lead up to World War II, 1939, the Soviet Union had an incentive to buck pass. It basically free rode. It was not going to join France to stop Nazi Germany. It basically buck passed, and it allowed France to fight Germany alone. During the World War II, England was to some extent free riding on the French in 1940. They didn't commit their entire air force to defend France. They kept it back in England, anticipating that France could fall. Now, balance of interest theory. This is a theory developed by Randall Schweller in his book Deadly Imbalances, written in 1998. So great powers are all states that include the most powerful and all other states that are no weaker than 50% of the power of the top state. So this is the membership of the international system. There are lesser great powers, and they have the remaining significant states that fall below or above the 50% threshold. Poles within a system are major powers for Schweller. They're not alliances. Stability is the likelihood in the system of the destruction of a state through war. A status quo state is a state that wants to preserve the system. A revisionist state is one that wants to overthrow the system. Revisionist states tend to prefer power over security as compared with status quo states, despite that acquiring power may actually reduce the security. If a state gets too much power, it'll look threatening to other states. The other states will balance against it, and then that state becomes less secure and more likely to be extinguished. Saddam Hussein's investment in a large military, attempting to build nuclear weapons, the attack on Kuwait ultimately led to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So Schweller has a theory of alliance formation. Schweller opposes balance of power theory. The idea of balance of power theory is that states join the weaker coalition. Schweller says this is wrong. For Schweller, status quo states usually ally together and they seek to maximize their security. To manage free riding and buck passing and maximize security, status quo states seek overwhelming coalitions. So a status quo state today would be like the US or England or Japan. These are older, more developed states, not eager to engage in war, and they're generally happy with the distribution of the benefits of the international system. China is not. It's a revisionist state. China wants to change the international institutions. It wants to change the geographic status quo in East Asia. Revisionist states usually ally together, creating a fragile offensive coalition. Revisionist states seek to maximize the individual shares of conquest profits. So they want minimum winning coalitions. So what does this explain? If you look at World War II, who are the revisionist states and how big was their coalition? You had Germany, Italy, Japan, Hungary, Finland, Romania, Bulgaria, Iraq, and Thailand. That's the axis. That's a very small coalition because the Germans and the Japanese wanted the minimum winning coalition because they wanted to maximize their gains. Allies that were excluded from the coalition were Spain and the USSR. They could have been included to make a bigger coalition. More and even poles improve systemic stability. But for Schweller, tripolarity is the least stable system. In the Second World War, you had Germany, you had the USSR, and you had the US. And because there were three of them, they didn't ally against the other third. You can see here in the chart, according to Schweller, the highest stability is unipolarity, then bipolarity. Tripolarity is very unstable. And then having a system of 4 states is more stable. Having a system that's odd, like 5 states, is less stable. So having an odd number of states is always less stable than having an even number of states. But even having 8 states will have less stability than having only 2 states. Now, those that argue that tripolarity is stable, that contradict Schweller, are as follows. There's Niu. Niu argues that middle state A will give land or surrender some territory to state B to deter state C. And you can see that depicted in the top graphic. Wagner argues that middle state A will fight more to stop attacker state B than state C. Right? That shouldn't be middle state. Yeah. So that's not middle state A, but rather middle state B. So middle state B will fight disproportionately one side more than another. Schweller argues that tripolarity is most unstable because it cannot be balanced by an alliance formation. If 2 of the 3 poles are revisionist, the 2 revisionist poles will attack the status quo state. But this will restore the system to an aggressive rivalry within a stable bipolarity. So, the two states A and B will carve up state C. It could also result in a revisionist pole A being tempted to seek to destroy pole B before pole C can intervene. So pole A could then destroy pole C. This was Hitler's strategy. Destroy your enemies in serial, one at a time, as fast as possible before they create a counter-coalition. If three of the three poles are revisionist, the same logic in an even more aggressive environment applies. Now, offensive realism is a variant of realism developed by John Mearsheimer in The Tragedy of the Great Powers, a 2001 book. Offensive realism has the added following assumptions. 1, states have offensive military capability. 2, states seek power rather than security, even though the security dilemma argues that the more power you have, the less security you have. Mearsheimer says that it's not historically accurate. All states, even democracies, expand until they encounter deterrence. States strategize to acquire more power. They can use blackmail, which is a form of compellence, or war to get what they want. State strategies are to maintain the balance of power against threats. The priority is to balance. And then it's to buck pass, to buck catchers. This is what the USSR got Germany to attack France in 1940 instead of attacking it. The third is to bait and bleed. You get other states to fight each other. Iran watched the US and Iraq fight each other over Kuwait, and then saw the same US attack Iraq in 2003. The US saw Iran and Iraq fight each other for almost a decade in the Iran-Iraq War. You could also engage in bloodletting, where you get other states to fight each other in a long war. That's the case of Iran and Iraq. And then there's appeasement. But appeasement and bandwagoning are very dangerous. So Mearsheimer's argument is that because of water barriers, which are the big oceans, global hegemony is impossible. Never happened. But regional hegemony is attainable. States are desperate. They're risk acceptant and will make war when they have some opportunity to achieve regional hegemony. Regional hegemony is so tempting, even otherwise moderate states will seize at the opportunity. Number 3, regional hegemons play the role of offshore balancers in other regions where allies can challenge potential regional hegemons by bridging the water barrier. So the U.S. is a regional hegemon in the Americas. The U.S. does not want China coming to America. So the U.S. plays an offshore balancing role in Asia. The U.S. provides weapons to South Korea. It has a division of Marines deployed in Okinawa, Japan. It provides assistance to Taiwan. So the U.S. is distracting China as an offshore balancer to keep it from coming to North America. Number 4, regional hegemons will jealously exclude other regional hegemons from their own region. The U.S. went to war against Germany in 1917 in World War I because of the Zimmermann telegram, because Germany wanted to use Mexico to attack the U.S. The U.S. reaction was, I don't want to anthropomorphize, but wildly emotional. The American people were so offended by that telegram that it pushed them over the edge to declare war against Germany. Number 5, the U.S. is the only regional hegemon in history. There's never been a global hegemon. So the U.S. dominates the Americas. Brazil doesn't dominate South America. Nigeria does not dominate West Africa. China does not dominate Asia. Russia does not dominate Eurasia. Germany does not dominate Europe. South Africa doesn't dominate Southern Africa. And the implication here is that the United Kingdom was never a hegemon. The U.S. had a large navy, but the UK had a large navy, but never a consequential army. So they were never a hegemon. They never dominated the globe, and they certainly never dominated Europe. So these are the hypotheses from John Mearsheimer. 1. Multipolarities with potential regional hegemons, whether they're asymmetric or unbalanced, are the most war-prone. So if you have a country that has a chance of becoming a regional hegemon and there is a multipolar region, you could have war. That's Nazi Germany in the 1930s. The second hypothesis, multipolar systems are moderately war-prone. So they're not super war-prone like the Neorealists argue, they're moderately. Hypothesis 3, bipolar systems are less war-prone than multipolar systems as there is less buck-passing. If you have the USSR and the US, well, they have to confront each other in the Cold War. There's no one else to help them. They can't avoid responsibility, so they're going to confront each other. In the absence of buck-passing, if the Soviet Union and France had unified against Nazi Germany, World War II would not have happened. Hypothesis 4, regions controlled by a regional hegemon are the most peaceful. Canada is very peaceful, thanks to the US. So you can look at some of the cases that Mearsheimer looked at. Japan's expansion from 1868 to 1945 was an unbalanced multipolarity, in which you had the USSR and the US buck-passing between each other until Japan could wait for the USSR to be preoccupied with Nazi Germany and then attack Pearl Harbor. German expansionism from 1870 to 1945 was again an unbalanced multipolarity in which the French and the USSR were buck-passing. Both the Japanese and Germans could not resist the small chance that they could dominate their continent, because that would bring so much power and security to the state. Soviet expansion from 1918 to 1991 during the Cold War was bipolar, so we had general stability. Italian expansion from 1861 to 1943, it was again unbalanced multipolarity. Italy wanted to dominate the Mediterranean, the Germans had distracted the English and defeated the French, so here was the Italian chance. And you had a lot of multipolar states, and Italy was, better than perhaps Spain or Turkey in terms of power, but it probably didn't have enough power to achieve it on its own. The U.S. expansion, 1800 to 1853, also unbalanced multipolarity. It basically had the European powers involved in some aspects of diplomacy. And finally, U.S. regional hegemony, which was achieved from 1853 to the present and has led to a peaceful continent. Now, Dale Copeland, in his book, The Origin of Major Power War, published in 2000, has a new theory called dynamic differentials realism. He argues that major wars include all the great powers, has fully mobilized participants, and countries are fighting for their existence or their survival. For him, there's three kinds of power. There's military power, economic power, and then there's potential power. Now, Copeland claims that all major power crises and wars are caused by declining states starting preventative wars. So here he rejects many of the assumptions that democracies don't start preventative wars. Rising powers do not initiate wars. So think about it. The US is in decline today and China is rising. Copeland's making the argument that if there's a war, it won't be China attacking Taiwan. It'll be the US acting against China first. So states begin crises and wars when the decline is deep and inevitable, but they still have military superiority. So this would predict that the US would attack China soon. Now there are 5 possible state responses. A country could initiate a war to a rising threat. It could initiate a crisis and try to resolve an issue. 3, it could do deterrence or containment, like create an institution like a NATO in the Pacific to stop the rise of China. It could do nothing and just adapt to the new situation. Or it could provide reassurance or accommodation, basically bring China into the international system, or reassure China that you're allowed to become a major power, we're not going to start a war against you. So crises are typically initiated to pressure an adversary to cede an objective, but it risks an inadvertent war. So the US could maybe provoke a naval dispute with China around Taiwan to try to teach China a lesson not to pressure America's ally. So these are some of his hypotheses, Copeland's hypotheses. Hypothesis 1A. Declining states and multipolar systems are more easily deterred as war benefits peaceful third parties. So war is unlikely. So the US is not going to attack China because China and the US will destroy each other. India will rise as the new great power. Hypothesis 1B. Offensive alliances are harder than defensive alliances because of the collective action problem. So it's very hard to coordinate these conquest type of alliances. Hypothesis 2. Declining preponderant powers in multipolar systems are less easily deterred as they can defeat coalitions. So war is likely. So the US is in decline. It can defeat a collection of opposing states. So war is likely. Hypothesis 3. Declining equal states in a bipolarity are likely to begin a war. So if you have two states and it's bipolar, and that's the US and China, then war is likely. Hypothesis 4. Power oscillations in a Cold War, or basically a peaceful, or basically a deterrent confrontation, may create closing windows of opportunity a declining state will exploit. So China today is about 60% or 70% of the American economy. Perhaps when the U.S., when China's 80 or 90% of the U.S. economy, the U.S. military will have one last chance to confront China. Hypothesis 5. Preemptive war may occur as states expect to be attacked. So maybe the U.S. thinks it's not starting the war against China. Maybe the U.S. detects a large Chinese convoy. It thinks it's going to be used to invade Taiwan, and so the U.S. acts. So maybe the U.S. acts preemptively, thinking they're not initiating the war, but they're acting before a war would start. And maybe they could be mistaken. Hypothesis 6. States may engage in crises that escalate to inadvertent war. And hypothesis 7. Crises with high audience costs may escalate to war. A crisis with a high audience cost is one in which the leaders have made a public commitment. Like in the U.S., the legislature has made a commitment to defend Taiwan. So if the U.S. is going to be believed, these politicians might feel pressured to defend Taiwan regardless of the issue, and there could be a chain-ganging event. So these are Copeland's many case studies. So you had in the Peloponnesian War, you had a declining Sparta that attacked a rising Athens. So here you have the status quo power, the stronger power, confronting a new potential hegemon. In the Second Punic War, you had a declining Carthage attacking a rising Rome. In Europe from 1521 to 1556, you had a declining France, which was attacking a rising Habsburg, Austrian, Spanish Empire in Italy and in the Americas. In the 30 Years' War, you had a declining Spain attacking a rising France, mostly in Belgium. The wars of Louis XIV, you had a declining France attacking a rising Austria. In the 7 Years' War, you had a declining France, Russia, Austria against this newly emergent state, Prussia. In the Napoleonic Wars, you had a declining France attacking a rising England. And one of the common arguments here that I see repeatedly is that whether or not you had a French Revolution, France was going to attack anyway, even without having a revolution. In World War I, you had a declining Germany preventatively attacking a rising Russia. Russia was industrializing very quickly in the lead up to World War I. And if Germany didn't attack, Russia would have exceeded Germany's economy, as it ultimately did in the form of the Soviet Union. In World War II, again, the Germans attacked preventatively to stop a rising USSR. During the Cold War, the US started a Cold War to blunt a rising Soviet Union.